Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast. Today, we're talking big woods, low deer density, mountain hunting with Mr. Jason Redd. Jason, how are you?
Man, I'm doing all right. Hope you guys are.
Yeah, doing well, doing
Yeah,
well.
doing good. Jacob, how are you doing?
Doing well. Again, I wish I could have killed a big buck this past weekend, but just was not able to do that. But deer season's hot and heavy for us here. I know, Jason, you've been hunting for a good bit as well in North Carolina season. You're coming from the great state of North Carolina, which we got a lot of North Carolina listeners and people in the Appalachian Mountains. Now, Appalachian.
Yep.
Every time I say Appalachian, I'm drugged through the dirt by listeners that live anywhere from Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, and so on. So I don't know how you pronounce it, Jason, but
Appalachian. I mean, it's funny you say that. When Bo was down for our open house few back in August, he was mispronouncing it, and man, we were giving him so much crap, for being from PA.
Yeah. Well, I can relate with Bo, so I always got to take a step to think about that. But Jason, excited to have you on the podcast. I talked to Andrew about this. I've been wanting to get you on for a while now because I've listened to a lot of your episodes you've done with Bo on East Meets West podcast, and kind of got me fascinated just because we do have a lot of listeners in North Carolina, but a lot of them based off just the analytics we have are more kind of central and eastern North Carolina. And you guys over in the western part of the state deal with some really interesting, styles of whitetail hunting. And we're going to talk a little bit about this low deer density, higher elevation. Some of these areas may lack logging activity, which again can cause for lower deer numbers as well. But again, you're still successful in those areas. And again, you're a big traditional archer hunter, and then also kind of get out there and do some scouting, with a muzzlet or a gun when you have the opportunity during those seasons. So there's a lot here to talk about. And I think we'll get a lot of really positive feedback from the listeners. But Jason, as a background, are you born and raised in North Carolina, or what is your history when it comes to specifically hunting in North Carolina?
No, I'm not. I wasn't born here. I've been here for 14 years. I grew up in the Delta in Arkansas. So grew up hunting the swamps and river bottoms and sloughs and stuff. And then I moved here for a job change back in 2009. So I wanted to get away from the mosquitoes and the meth. It's pretty wild down in Arkansas. I love it down there, but I moved up here, wanted to get in the mountains, and so it was definitely a transition for me from a hunting perspective. I started hunting when I was 7 years old, and I'm 43 now, and I've always hunted public land. I was on a lease for a little bit in Ohio for 1 year, and it just wasn't for me. I felt like I was trapped, like I like to wander, always have. But it took me a while to figure out deer hunting up here for sure, but man, I really do enjoy it. It's a really good experience. And what I always tell people, especially guys that want to go out west, is you can have a western style experience, which I know we're going to talk about this a little bit, but you can have that here on the East Coast, and really it's a good prep for you before you go out west too.
Oh, absolutely. And you opened a can of worms I really want to dive into.
A lot of meat on the bones here.
So the very first thing, Jason, since you are from the Delta region of Arkansas, which we have a lot of Arkansas listeners as well, I want to talk about when you started hunting in North Carolina, especially that western part of the state. What was some of the biggest hurdles you had to overcome just when it came to finding deer, let alone having any kind of success early on?
I think the biggest thing for me is obviously growing up where I did. You lived and hunted river bottoms, and I thought here that the deer would be in the bottoms, which you can find sign there, but you rarely, you're going to kill a deer in the bottoms here. You got to be up in the mountains. So that was the biggest thing for me. And honestly, realizing what type of terrain deer would actually travel in. I mean, there's some goat face steep stuff here, and that's really where I find most of my older age class deer. And I never would have thought that, growing, when I first got here at all. I didn't think deer would go through boulder fields or anything like that, but then they're pretty much like goats.
It's like the more rugged the terrain is, the more likely you're going to find that mature buck in that general area than the more gradual slopes that maybe, if there is much hunting pressure, a lot more guys are going to kind of lean towards those more gradual slopes and those secondary points than getting on some of those steeper faces that's got a lot more gnarly terrain and, probably a lot less good quality footholds to be able to get in the stand or, get in the saddle or anything like that.
Yeah, I want to interrupt here and cross-reference back to an episode we did last season. I think it's called Big Bucks in Aggressive Terrain with Adam Turner. He's a North Georgia hunter, and he said something similar. All of his bigger bucks are coming from, like, if you're looking at slope angle shading on Onyx or something, it's coming from that red purple stuff, the nastiest of the nasty. And he found a lot of luck finding mature bucks, like you're saying, in areas like that. But I'm curious, are you finding just mature bucks there, or are you just kind of finding all the deer in that more aggressive terrain?
Well, I mean, honestly, in my experience, I typically find most of my mature age class deer on your north facing sides, and northeast, because that area stays a little bit more shaded. Is my philosophy. You'll find a lot of your younger age class deer and your does bed more on the south side, and my philosophy on that is that you think about it, a older buck, he's heavier, he's bigger, he heats up a lot easier, and it really doesn't get cold enough here to where they'll need to go to that south side. So predominantly from a bedding perspective and everything, I typically find them on those north facing sides.
Is
And
that is that early season, or does that stretch on into late season as well?
pretty much pretty much year round, to be honest with you. They sometimes when the foliage is heavy, especially in these mature hardwoods, you may find them a little bit lower. But as that foliage starts to drop, they start losing cover. They'll work their way up higher up the ridge. But if I'm going into a new spot, I'm starting high first. I'll tell you that.
Okay, that makes sense. So when I've hunted more mountainous, we're just jumping right into this. When I've hunted more mountainous areas, typically the this isn't true all the time, but a lot of times the north facing slopes from here are very open. There's just like a distinct timber change. And then the south facing slopes, they might have more saplings, or they might have like a glade on it. Like usually there's just better cover on the south facing slope. Are you finding it something similar, and those mature bucks are bedded in your more open woods as opposed to seeking out the cover?
I mean, you're still going to find cover there, especially when you get higher up, you start running into roto. I typically don't see a lot of them bedding in super thick roto. They may be on the edge, but in my opinion, I think a deer up here, the wind varies so much. I don't think they're wind-based bedding. There's more thermal, and also I think it's a lot of site specific. They like to be able to see. So, the higher up they can see through that open timber a lot better and see what's coming in.
Yeah. And to clarify, rhododendron, right?
Yes, rhododendron. We have rhododendron and we have laurel. A lot of people get the two mixed up. Laurel is more like a bush, and rhododendron's like a nightmare of, 6 to 8 inch thick woody stuff that it's almost impenetrable. I mean, it is impenetrable in some areas for sure. Yep. Jacob and I were talking about that yesterday.
That's where I was going to go with this. So rhododendron, that's something that I haven't seen a whole bunch like down here in Alabama, and even when we were in Georgia, I didn't really see. It's not a little bit of mountain laurel.
Yeah,
where
I didn't
we're
see
at.
any rhododendron.
But rhododendron, we were just up in I was just up in Gatlinburg for my soon-to-be brother-in-law's bachelor party, and he's a big hiker. We went hiking some trails, and one of the trailheads, it was just all the way up the mountain. I think we climbed it was like 1,400 feet on that hike, and it was rhododendron everywhere. And it's so much bigger than mountain laurel is. And like we were talking about yesterday, Jason, it's like you walk up to it, it's like, how can an animal get through this stuff? Because this is a tangled mess. I mean, it makes mountain laurel look like, walking through a meadow, okay? at least the mountain laurel that I've dealt with. It is unbelievably thick. But you were talking about, it's still surprising how deer, but also bear will still use rhododendron in certain areas, or rhodo, as you call it, and still be able to kind of travel through it or make trails through it where you'd look at it and it's just a wall of like impenetrable, like suck factor is the way I describe it.
Oh yeah, yeah. Especially you get on the ridge tops. A lot of times, bears typically want to travel ridge tops, from what I see. And a lot if you're in a high density bear area, you'll find a bear trail a lot of times cutting through it. And that's some of the easiest ways for me to get through it is with a bear trail. But like I was telling you yesterday, I've been in laurel thickets. I mean, rhodo thickets at night, even with Spartan Forge or Onyx, and pretty much still get turned around in there if you don't know where you're going. It's just a maze, man. Especially on like a foggy, early season, you can get pretty foggy. It's pretty crazy in there. And but to your point, man, animals can run through that stuff. Especially, I see bears just run it over when they go through it. If you spook them.
Yeah, I go back, and I told you this yesterday, but I go back to interview we did with Adam Jolly, Heath Jolly's buddy or brother, which of course I know you know Heath pretty well. He was talking about in North Carolina, walking one of those bear trails through the Rodo, and took a left-hand bend in that trail and came face to face like 10 to 15 feet of a big bear. And bear wanted nothing to do with him, and it was dark, and it just went plowing through that stuff. And he was just talking about like, if a bear can push through that crap as easy as he did jumping off that ridge, he's like, it's extremely impressive because he's like, it'd take everything in your body to try to get through that, and you probably still won't if there's not a trail cutting through that stuff.
Oh yeah, it wants to, because all the branches and stuff, they just kind of weave together, and man, it is a nightmare going through. I mean, that's kind of why, like, when I started making shorter sticks at first, like 20-inch and stuff, is because it's all the compact to the side of my pack, so I can easily slide through stuff. Because if not, I remember when I used to hunt with a climbing stand a little bit up here, that stuff grabbing the climbing stand, strap that goes around, man, it just, I mean, especially when you're going up a hillside, it's 50% grade for a mile. Like you're already tired and angry, and then all of a sudden you're getting tangled up and everything. It is something else, but it's good. I mean, when I'm looking at, because does really like to bed in that stuff too, if you don't have a lot of other good cover. And so if you look at a map, especially like winter imagery, you'll see like the rhodo thickets and like terrain features, and that's a good place to kind of catch bucks cruising too on downwind sides of those rhodo thickets.
So I want to back it up a little bit and kind of reiterate some stuff, because I really want to get into your mindset when tackling these areas, because again, you're hunting really vast areas, very rough terrain, very low deer densities. And a lot of the guys, especially maybe if they're newer to hunting it, or maybe they've been hunting it for a while and they're not having the kind of success that they want, it can be really overwhelming looking at a map and just looking at who knows how many acres, massive national forest that we have up and down the East Coast. What is your mindset to actually figure out an area to just focus on? Are you just looking for the roughest terrain you can find? I mean, are you just looking for areas where you can get really far from a road, or are you looking for overlooked areas? What is your mindset to break down a massive area into, okay, I'm going to go to this ridge?
Well, one thing, history repeats itself. So like when you find and you actually, locate one deer in some terrain, or you kill one there, if you kind of like try to replicate that somewhere else, those are always good places to start. I mean, for me, one thing that I find to have a lot of success with, and I always look for first, is if I can find a north facing side that's has the right terrain features, pretty steep, some good pinch points. And one thing I really do like too is to find, if I can find where a stream starts, a branch, like a blue line starting on that north facing side, I like to go there, because typically around those areas, one, there's going to be a water source. Two, in those areas, you're going to have the opportunity for more of your high stem count stuff, which is kind of pretty rare, but you will find that type of stuff on those north facing sides with those springs. And you'll find them around those heads of those springs anywhere. But that, when you don't have much food, that is a good food source, especially to hold a buck through the summer. So I start looking at those, and that's like my first thing. I mean, it's not real hard to get away from people up here. That's the big thing. I rarely run into other hunters, which is good, because you don't have to worry about anybody boogering a deer you're hunting, or you don't have to worry about that at all. I mean, like, in the last 5 years, I've maybe seen one or two people up in some of the areas I hunt. But the thing is, you can look at a track, a big track, and you can go in there and you may hit 10 and find one that's holding deer, though. That's the thing. It's a lot of boots on the ground. But, like I always believe, your deer get killed in the postseason, because that's when your sign's fresh. You go in a scout. You got to put the boots on the ground to find the deer here. That's all it is. I mean, it's just lots of walking, lots of hiking. You just got to enjoy being out there to really find them.
And speak about walking, hiking a whole bunch. You were telling me about a specific buck that you've been trying to kill for 4 years, and you had to hike in 3.5 miles in one direction just to get into where that deer is at. And you were just telling me yesterday that you did 3 sits, total of 18 miles round trip, going into that spot. Which you think about, if even if it was flat land, a lot of guys aren't going to be walking 3 miles plus back into a spot. Let alone you start talking elevation change, the thick cover we're talking about with the mountain laurel and rhododendron and everything else. Like when in that example, because I want to kind of get to, as we're talking about this, like is there any other specific, terrain features that you really like and things that will hold, mature bucks? But before we do that, like with that specific deer, what led you into that area to decide that, hey, I'm going to be doing, 7 miles roughly, almost round trip, just to try to sit on this deer one time, one day, one sit? What got you into a spot like that? And then also, where do you see I guess kind of two-part question. Where do you see like the value of doing that versus trying to find a buck a little bit closer? Is it just like, based off the location, that's why that buck's using it? Or what got you so sucked into a spot like that?
Well, on that specific spot, which I try to look for this too, if I can, it's not very common here, but there are spots. If you can find some national forest that a mountain that runs out and it has some ag around it, that's going to be a good spot. Ag, or even like I was telling you yesterday, we have a lot of second home developments up in the mountains here, and those areas we call them hosta bucks because these deer are living off people's flowers and stuff. So if you can find areas that have those food sources close by, that's a really good place to start looking for sure. You're going to see a little bit better deer density there. And this spot, essentially is exactly that. It's essentially a long mountain that goes out and is surrounded by ag, mainly just pastures and stuff. And so, but to get to, like I love, like a north facing point with some east and west finger ridges coming off is what how this place lays out. And that's a really good recipe, a lot of terrain features there. So that's how I got into that area and found that buck, which I found him 4 years ago. And funny enough, I actually got him on camera. I put this all together last year. I got him on camera, and that's the reason I'm saying 4 years. I got him on camera back in 19, about a mile and a half from there, across all that ag. There's another ridge it runs, and I got him on camera there, and then put it together that this was the same deer. But I went in there originally turkey hunting because I figured there'd be some turkeys in there. And when I'm turkey hunting, I'm also deer scouting. So, and I found some big rubs, and came in, put a camera in there, and got him on camera, and I've been hunting him ever since. But it's funny enough, I actually I don't name deer much, but I named him Everest. And the reason I did that is because I was calculating, roughly that in the years I've been hunting him, I probably could have summited Everest at least twice. So that's why I'm calling him Everest. I was actually in there this morning. That's where I was hunting this morning.
I want to again just take a little step back here because you mentioned something that piqued my interest, and that was you're talking about you'll pick these areas out based on terrain features and whatnot that you want to go look at, and you might go check 10 of them, and one of them it has deer and it's worth hunting. What are you actually looking for when you go in there? Because it's such a low deer density area that this is whenever we've hunted low deer density areas like what you're talking about, the challenge that we hit is what is actually good sign. Like, am I looking for literally a rub or a set of tracks, or am I looking for more than that? Because that's always hard to gauge. Like, what amount of deer sign are you needing? Or do you just need to see that they exist there, or I mean, what's it look like for you?
Primarily, I'm looking for a mature sign is what I'm looking for. You don't commonly see tracks here very much because the ground's so hard. So that's kind of tough. Deer trails, or you can find deer trails a good bit of time, but like a mature buck trail, he's not typically using the same trails as everybody else anyway, so it's kind of hard to locate it based on that. But any type of mature sign, what I'm looking for is obviously some big rubs, but you know not necessarily just that. If I see stuff twisted off at the ground, that's a good indicator for me. If I find some scrapes and see some high licking branches, that shows me that's going to be a bigger deer. And then when I do find that type of sign, I'm kind of honed in on that because that's what I do. I find a deer or a couple good bucks, and I just pretty much get fixed on them until I get them killed or they die, of old age. And what I'll do, when I find some big sign like that, I'll start backtracking it, or sometimes, because the deer up here, because there's not as much competition, they typically don't leave a ton of sign either. So usually when you can identify if signs based on like he's cruising during the rut, typically, just laying those rubs down. But when you get in, you find a lot of cluster rubs. You're typically going to be in his home range. So that's where I like to key in on. And if I do happen to find his bed or his home range or where I think he may be bedding and traveling, one of the best things that I found is if I put a mock scrape in there, he more than likely is going to hit it.
Okay, interesting.
And I put a cam on that, and then after that, it's game on. And I don't use a lot of trail cameras. I mean, like I've got the most I've ever had right now, and this is between 2 states, and I've got 8.
Okay. Now, you said something interesting about scrapes. You're looking for high licking branches. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, because it's just deer body size, right? If I find a licking branch, it's above my head. I'm 6'2". It's typically going to be a bigger deer that's done that. It's broke those off, and so and sometimes you can find tracks in the in a pretty good scrape. You can see, if they've been working enough, you can see a track in there, and tracks are good. But the thing is, and I learned this from my good buddy Nathan Killen. Was a taxidermist for a number of years and seen tons of big deer. You can't always judge a track based on the deer because there's what he's told me. He's like, I've seen some really, really big deer with small feet. So you got to kind of look for those rubs, and that's a good indicator. And obviously the scrapes, but yeah, it's few and far, I will say.
Yeah. So rubs, like you're talking about rubs being twisted off at the ground. We've talked about that a lot in recent episodes. But does any kind of feed sign or anything like that ever factor in for what you're looking at? Are you looking for where they're feeding under maybe some oaks way up in the mountains or whatever other kind of food sources there are up there?
Yeah. I mean, oaks are king. I mean, the oaks are king here because essentially, they've got browse. They'll eat mushrooms, and hard times they'll eat laurel. But they'll eat mushrooms, some ferns. But yeah, the oaks are key, and finding feed sign, especially in a year that they're kind of sparse, is good. Like this year, we're absolutely loaded down with oaks. I mean, there's so many out there right now. Like I've slipped on them. And which funny, we were talking about Heath. Heath slipped the other day. He called me this week, and we were talking. He slipped and fell during muzzleloader season and knocked his scope off. Because I mean, it's like walking on marbles. They're so bad this year, which kind of it makes it a challenge because they don't have to move very far to find food.
Yeah. And that kind of makes me curious about, gauging, like your most recent sign when you're going into an area and knowing that you're consistently on the deer. So like, I'm just sitting here thinking like, okay, like Jason, me and you are going out tomorrow, mid to late October, into an area that maybe you haven't been to in a couple weeks. When we get there, what are you looking for to tell us that like, hey, we need to put more time into this area versus no, we should probably bounce to the next one? Are you just looking for stuff that's been made within the last week? Like, are you finding that kind of concentration of sign?
Yeah, you can. I mean, the interesting thing about, in every buck, mature deer, like people, they all have different personalities. So, some are more aggressive, some are more social. A lot of them are a little bit more introverted. And, I think, your older age class deer typically tend to be a little bit more introverted. They like to be by themselves. So, if I, but what point I was making there is that these suckers, man, they may only come through that area every 5 days. So it's pretty much a waiting game is the key. It's your butt in the stand. But if you're right now, like, if I see a fresh scrape, that's good, especially when there's so much food, you got to go to the next thing. Okay. And what is that? It's gonna be fresh rubs or good active scrape. That's where you're gonna spend your time because, there's just so much food that it's hard to just focus on that because they can just get it anywhere right now with this many acorns.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting subject because I was talking to a friend of ours, Rocky Smith, here in Alabama. He's been on the podcast before, but he hunts similar stuff to what you do as far as the low deer density stuff goes. And he was telling me that it's like, it's amazing that he's like, man, it's amazing that I ever killed one of these deer just because you're in this big wilderness or whatever, and you just happen to cross paths with that deer. And he was saying that a lot of them are very nomadic, and similar to what you're saying, they're going to come through on a circuit, every couple days. And so it's like, do you move around? Do you stay? Because, if you're moving, he's moving, and, you just have to find that right terrain feature where you're going to end up crossing paths with him. And that's one thing that made me curious about asking about that, about the concentration assigned, because it's like, if he's only coming through one time every 5 to 7 days, like, how much sign is he actually going to leave? So it's like, how do you know that you're on that right terrain feature, you're on that right habitat feature where you're going to end up getting an encounter with this buck in this massive area?
Yeah, and the beauty of having low deer density is, one, you can set up mainly to hunt him, right? You don't usually typically have to worry about getting busted by another deer. And also, going in there for multiple days to set one spot, and I may make some minor adjustments, get closer to where I, either know his bed is or think he may be bed, and just keep pushing a little bit closer. But you're typically not going to burn that spot out like you can in areas that have a lot higher deer density, because they're not going to pick up on your sign as much. And that's, and it's kind of contradictive to what we do as mobile hunters, right? It's like always moving and being mobile, but up here, you pretty much just got to sit on them and just wait them out. I mean, like that one of the bucks behind me there, I hunted him one year real hard. The year I killed him, I hunted him really, really hard. I think I set him at least 40 times, and he was the only deer I saw that year. But I just knew he was in there, and I just kept looking and finding. And actually, how I killed him, I went up into a new drainage that I thought that I hadn't checked, and bumped him out of his bed, and then come back and killed him the next day.
Oh, interesting.
Okay.
Oh, I want to talk about that.
Yeah, we're gonna dive. Let's dive in that real quick because this is something I'm curious. First off, how is he bedded in that drainage system? And then once you jumped him, how did you put the pieces together where you needed to sit in order to kill it deer? Was it like over the bed? Was it a travel corridor or a path of travel going back to the bed? How did you figure that out?
So this is like I was saying earlier. This is it was a spot that had a creek that started up in this holler, and I was easing up that creek on the I guess that'd have been the north side, because the creek actually came off a north, because our mountains here typically, our main systems run north south, and then your fingers run off east west. And this creek drainage started off coming down from the east. So it came down from the east, so I was on the north side of it, easing up, kind of using that the creek itself to kind of hide because it was real dry, and leaves, when these old growth trees drop, it's just carpeted with heavy, thick leaves. So walking through there, it's just, there's no way to be quiet sometimes. So I was using that creek to kind of hide my sound walking up, and I had the wind blowing in my face, and I got up and I started seeing some good rubs, and I was like, all right, this could be it. And I get up a little bit higher, and I notice a deer pop out of his bed, and I see him run up. He was essentially bedded right on the north side of where that creek started, kind of like I was talking about, right there where that spring started for that creek. And I saw him go up, and he stopped, and I saw it was a big deer. And honestly, I didn't even know it was exactly the deer that I was after, but I just knew he was a mature buck. So, and I just stopped right there. I didn't push any further because I was about 75 yards from him. And he didn't know what I was. He turned to look back. He didn't have my wind. He never really saw me, and he just kind of like walked off after that. So immediately I kind of scanned the area, and I use my binos a lot when I get in a situation like that to kind of look for rubs or any type of little thing. And I saw on that north, there was so that creek ran like, coming down from the east, and then you had two finger ridges coming off the east on each side of the creek. And on the one that was on that northern side of that creek, I noticed some rubs coming down that side. And so I had my stand on my back, because a lot of times when I'm hunting like that, I got my stand on my back. And this was during archery season, and late archery season too. And we'll talk about that a little bit. That's another key thing, is I saw those rubs, found a perfect tree. I love a split tree. It's my favorite. And there was a good split tree right there, and I went ahead and set my stand then. And I knew there was some rain coming in, and that night, and I determined I was going to hunt him the next evening. And I went in that next evening, and I killed him at 5:30.
All right, so let me ask you this: when you found that tree, how far was that tree off his sign or off where he was bedded at?
From his bed, it was probably 75 yards, because essentially almost right there where I was standing. It was just a little bit more toward the north, and I was probably about 15 yards off that rub line that I saw coming down. And yeah, at about 5:20, I heard something, looked up and saw him coming down that side on that line, and yeah, I shot him. He even though he got hit, I shot him. He kind of walked at a fast pace. I saw blood coming out. He walked into the rhodo thicket, and I just watched him fall right there. And oddly enough, I mean, he was a one-eyed deer, and that side was his blind side, so I think that helped me out a lot.
That's so you were hunting the rub line going down to that bed? Did I hear that right?
It was coming off the bed. He was coming off that bed,
Okay.
working that side. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that tree was positioned where you were getting close to his bed, but he couldn't see that tree from his bed. So he was in the bed when you made your approach.
Yeah, he was in his bed when I made that approach, and I did the same thing I did the day I saw him. I used that creek to come up, and then as I got up to about level with my stand, I just took my time and just eased right in there and slipped up in there. I didn't know I couldn't see his bed from where I was at because it was so thick, but I was just obviously gambling that he was going to come back. And these mature bucks like that, it's hard to run them off that bed because they feel very, very comfortable there. And essentially, the system, it worked for them, right? So everything worked out for him. He didn't get hurt. The day I bumped him, so he came right back to that bed. But I was gambling on that he was going to come back, and yes, sure enough, he did. And the thing was, I had a camera that I found in there during gun season. I went in there first time I ever been in that area. Did it, man? I had to come in off the parkway actually, and you had to drop down in this place, and it was an absolute hellhole, man. It was about 3.5, 4 miles one way, and it was murderous, man. But I went in there. I'd always looked at this spot. It was very remote. If you didn't come from the parkway, the closest trailhead was like 9 miles. So I didn't figure I'd see many people in there at all. So I knew there could be an older deer in there. And during that gun hunt, I went in there on Thanksgiving Day, just me and the gun and walking around with my backpack and just slipping through, looking for sign. Found a really big scrape down the bottom, and I put a cam on that. And then I eased through there that morning. I actually killed a buck that morning. That was cruising up a creek coming from the down below even further. He was cruising a scrape line that was running along that creek. There's like rhodo. A lot of our creeks have rhodo on both sides, and he was just scent checking that and working that scrape line. And I shot him at 25 yards with a rifle. And then I came back in during turkey season. That place used to be loaded with turkeys, and came in there, pulled my cam when I was turkey hunting, and had 4 or 5 good bucks, but he was really the biggest one by far. And the year I got him on cam, which that would have been 17, he was a mainframe 10-point with double split eye guards. And when I killed him, I didn't put it together because he had went downhill, and he was a mainframe 8 with only one split eye guard. But the big thing that really, showed me that it was him is he had one eye, because I saw he had one eye in that trail cam photo.
No, that's fascinating. And when you said you killed him late archery season, what timing of the year is that?
So we have an archery season, which I hear they're doing away with it next year, which really pisses me off. But it's my favorite time to hunt. So our gun season typically ends around, I believe, December 1st. And then archery comes in until the end of the year, and it's archery only, buck only. And I've killed and seen most of my big deer on their feet during that time frame, typically between December 13th and the 31st.
All right, so we're talking post rut here. Now I'm very interested in this because a lot of guys would think, you kind of get in that post rut time period. It's a little bit more of a struggle bus because the buck's kind of honing back in on potential food sources, more in the isolation stuff like that. Why have you like if you look back and analyze the success you've had either killing bucks that time of the year or also just getting observations and actually encounters with them? Why do you think that's the case more so than that pre-rut time period or even during the rut?
Because I'm a believer in this secondary rut, and I think those older age class deer, they're efficient animals. They've been doing this for a long time, and it's kind of like, why, like when I go to the Midwest, I don't want to be in Ohio on November the 5th. I want to be there, the last weekend of October into that first week of November is like my prime time. And if you look at historically, if you go to like use Ohio for instance, go look at their big buck registry. You notice most of the bigger age, the bigger deer there are going to be the higher older age class, right? You notice most of them are killed around Halloween and they're killed around Thanksgiving. And so my theory on that is like, bucks understand, and you see this with turkeys too, like, old turkey, hens come to them. And like, I'm a believer that a lot of your seasoned does want to breed with the more older age class animals. And also these older bucks have been around enough that they want to catch those early does coming in. So you'll catch them early then, and then they want to catch these yearlings that are coming in later on in the season. Whereas these younger bucks just run crazy all year and they're just kind of ran out. Like, so I don't see as much rutting activity with the younger age class deer in that late season that I do the older age class. But I do see on cam, on the hoof, most of my big deer from December 13th, and I'll see them rutting all the way into like January. And I even see them hitting scrapes early February. And in that like Jordan, my business partner, he I guess it was 2 years ago, he sent me a picture from the stand of a fawn that was spotted up all the way to its neck in October. So that just kind of proves it as well.
Oh, see, that's super fascinating. That is just to me that's this gold of like the idea of just because there's so many guys, and I've been guilty of this in the past, that's so focused on the rut, and like where we're at in the southeast in Alabama, there's so many different pockets of deer. Like I think in Alabama, it's like the state's confirmed is it 5 or 6 different rut
I think
times?
it's 5, like pretty distinct
Ruts.
Yeah.
But it's not in the same area. Like you got to travel to different counties, just how the restocking efforts and everything happen. So like you could chase rutting deer from, first week of November all the way through the end of season, February 10th, if you wanted to travel. So that's typical of what we've done, but we haven't really, again, lived in the state per se that you have a very defined rut, and then afterwards, most of the guys, pick up whether they're waterfowl hunters or whatever, but after the rut, they kind of, slow down. You have a lot less pressure in the woods typically, post rut, getting into that late season time period. So it's good to see and hear that, you've had a lot of success that time period when a lot of other guys are thinking of different things. They're not worried about necessarily getting back in the woods. If they don't kill one during the rut or pre-rut, they may be done if they're not like a overly serious, whitetail hunter per se.
Yeah. Well, and most guys, they want to go during that peak, which, essentially is your chasing stage anyway. So, because they're seeing more deer, they're seeing more bucks, but really, how many times you've been in the woods when they're chasing, you actually can get a shot at one, like he's just running around. Also, you're going to have more people at that time. And my biggest thing is, and that's one reason I like low deer density is because I'd much rather see less deer and no people than see a lot of deer and a bunch of people. I mean, I like being out there in solitude by myself. I'm pretty much a solo hunter. And I don't, when I travel out of state, I rarely go during that peak time. I want to be there right before, because if you go that early stage, like if you get on a deer, like say in Ohio, that late October, you have one encounter with him, there's a good chance he's still going to be in that area. Whereas you go hit that 5th, 6th, when it's, where they say is the peak there, you're not going to see that deer again. He's potentially a roamer or whatever. He's just running, lights out looking for does at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And plus, I'm guessing probably where you've hunted in Ohio, it's a lot higher deer numbers, so there's probably a lot more competition, and those bucks probably have to cover more ground. Even if it's a mature buck, then can say what you're doing in North Carolina, where the bucks still may travel a whole bunch, but they have their few little doe pockets that they'll key in on, or like you said, the does potentially come to them at certain timings. So that makes it more challenging as well if you're trying to hunt a specific deer. And that's why we've interviewed guys that when they're hunting a specific deer, they hate the rut. They're like, that peak time of the rut is the worst time to try to kill a specific deer because there's no guarantee unless he just has a personality that is not a roamer, which, you hear reports on every now and then, like, some bucks, we've interviewed guys that said they killed a specific buck that didn't even think that he really took part in the rut a whole bunch, just because he'd never really moved a whole bunch. He stayed in one little core area and maybe had some does there, but he wasn't going out on these big runs trying to find other does. But like in your circumstances, like, they kind of get honed back in a specific spot that you can kind of target them, which kind of goes into one thing that you brought up, especially early in the podcast. I want to kind of touch on specifically with some of these bucks is you mentioned that a lot of times you see like bucks bedding in an area or in ways that it's more thermal based, not wind based. Can you just talk about that? Like, how have you found like that and come to that conclusion? And is there any other like outlying factors that will probably show you, hey, there's a mature buck bedding in this area based off not only just how the thermals work, but is there a cover association with that, or is it more visual based? Like, what are the other outlying factors for like a buck to bed in a specific area?
I think from my experience, a buck here in the mountains, he's typically going to have good cover close by, but he's going to be on the edge, so he can jump into it if he has to get away. In the wind here, man, like they can call for whatever wind they want. I don't even pay attention to it. Because I can be on the south side of the mountain, and you can have a saddle there. It's causing, the terrain's causing the wind to do all kind of crazy things, obviously. And so like I just don't think the wind plays a factor for them. But the thermals, thermals are always going to be consistent unless the wind's is high enough to where it takes over the thermals. One thing I don't typically hunt here a lot when we have high wind though, because we don't usually get a ton of high wind, and I think it kind of shuts those deer down. Because a mature deer, he's kind of on edge all the time anyway, and I think with all that movement in the trees and all the noise, like I think he feels unstable, so he's going to pretty much stay put. But I've seen deer come in, with wind blowing in their face. I've seen it, coming in with wind blowing up their butt, but the thermals are usually in his benefit.
Also, well, in addition to all that, when it comes to the time that you've had success, you talked about you really like that kind of late season, kind of post rut time period, but also when you're looking at the whole season in general, do these bucks seem to shift, like these mature bucks seem to shift at all throughout the season? Or do you see them, like, once you find them, if you find them in October or even, September when y'all season opens, but say like October, November, will he stay in that general area most of the season? Or is it very specific on each individual buck? Like one buck may reshift, quite a bit of distance. You have to relocate him, and other bucks may like kind of hold tight there for the rest of the season as long as they have the cover and the food source available.
I think that's based on their own individual personality. Because like that buck I've been hunting right now, like when I saw him back in that first year, I saw him in 19, about essentially a mile and a half, 2 miles from there. He was, I would say he was probably 4. I mean, I'm guessing his age now to be anywhere from 7 to 8, because he could have been 3, but I don't think so, because a 3-year-old deer, when I saw him, aren't typically that big. But as he's gotten older, I haven't noticed him really specifically leaving this area that I'm in now. Like he pretty much hangs out there all year. Now it is a pretty decent sized track. So he roams that track. Don't get me wrong. I get him on the north side and I get him on the south side. I typically see him a little bit more on the south side early season. And but in that same area, this deer, he's a really big deer for here. I mean, he's probably mid 140s. 8-9-year-old deer, anywhere from 7 to 9 is what I'm guessing. But in that same area, I've got a buck that I see every year on camera around Christmas, and he's bigger than the deer I'm hunting, but he's a roamer. I only see him during that time. I saw him the 23rd on cam what was that, in 2021, and then last year I saw him on another cam on the 24th, I believe, and he just comes through. And those roamers, man, like you can you can throw your game at them if you want, but those are the hardest deer to kill, are the ones that are roaming like that. You know, you really want to put your time and focus on a deer that you know is living and inhabiting that area. You know that you're going to want to waste those, you know, putting that much time in this tree.
Jason, I wanted to hit on thermals for a second because you mentioned a lot of times these bucks are going to have thermals in their advantage. And you also mentioned that you like keying in on north facing slopes. And one thing that's been kind of a subject of conversation for us lately is the whole idea of like a delayed thermal. And I actually experienced this past weekend where it was like sunrise is at about 6:45 a.m. where I was at this time of year. So about 6:45, sun comes up. I was on a north facing slope, kind of in like a little hellhole. I mean, kind of in a pretty rough little area that was very steep, and it was almost 9 a.m. at that point. It was like 8:50, so 2 hours after legal sunrise, and I still had a very strong dropping thermal. And so a lot of people will be like, "Oh, your thermals are going to rise in the morning. You need to hunt, you know, according to that." But depending on where you're at, I mean, that's not always the case. So does that ever factor into how you're hunting with that delayed thermal effect?
Yeah, in this specific area, I got a good example of that. There's a north facing side um, that, well, the main ridge runs north south, and there's another little ridge that comes out to the north off of, you know, there's a saddle right there, and then there's another ridge that comes off to the north, and there's a creek in between, and that side is real steep. It's heavy timbered, and there's a creek that starts there. I don't care when you go in there, and I showed this to Bo. Bo, when he came up for the open house, we went there and checked some cameras, and he just wanted to see the area I was hunting and stuff. And this was in August, middle of the day. That place, the thermals always drop in there; they never rise. And I talked to a buddy of mine, Mr. Alan Altizer, about that, and it's just you got the creek pulling in your behalf. You got that shaded north facing side, and you got, you know, the terrain really doesn't play that big of a key with the thermals, but it always drops in there. And when um, I had an encounter with another really good buck in this area last year, and he would come, he was coming in with the wind to his face. It was, no, the wind was coming, he was blowing out of the north. So the wind was coming from his butt, and he was coming down the east side of that ridge, off that north ridge, and the thermals were dropping. And I had noticed he was putting his head down and then picking his head back up the whole time. And I talked to Mr. Allen about this. And by the way, y'all should get him on the podcast. I know you guys like the thermals, and he is a mad scientist when it comes to that. And you know, a lot of times people think a deer's trying to pick you out when they put their head down and pop it up. And he wasn't feeding. He wasn't putting his head all the way to the ground. And I was like, what was he doing? He said, well, that wind was coming through, and then the thermals dropping. So he was putting his head down, checking the thermals, and then putting his head back up to check the wind. That's why he was bobbing his head. And it's funny. That was the first time I ever heard anybody tell me that. But I've seen deer do that so many times, and never knew why. I just kind of thought they were trying. Maybe it somewhat thought I was there and trying to pick me off. You know how a doe will put their head down and throw it up real quick to look at you. But essentially, that deer, he said, he was checking both the wind and the thermals as he was coming in.
Interesting. Very interesting. So, do you think that that's a factor with why bucks seem to gravitate towards those north-facing slopes? I mean, do you think they seek out areas where you're going to have either a constant falling thermal or just a delayed thermal effect?
I don't think so. Not necessarily. I think, they find an area that, because all animals, I mean, all breathing creatures need the same things. They need food, water, and cover, right? And if a buck can, an animal that's, essentially prey, he wants to be in a place where he feels safe. So that area, nobody ever goes in there. There are some coyotes, but that's about it, so he can stay back there. He's got all the food he needs. That creek drainage has some briars in it. So you got some high stem count stuff in there. It always produces oaks. He's got water, and he's got ag down at the bottom, like pastures. So he doesn't have to go anywhere. So, that I think that's the biggest thing. As long as he has all those key ingredients, he's going to be there. and he's going to stay put too. I mean, unless he's cruising around looking for does. The only time I'll see him kind of change too is, this old growth forest. Once, you will typically kind of find them a little bit lower on the mountain, but as the foliage starts to drop, they're going to move up because, there's less cover there.
Okay, that makes sense. And that kind of brings me to one of my next things I'm wondering about, and that is terrain features that you like to actually hunt. And I'm really curious about hunting really large terrain features. Like, are you ever focusing on like big saddles, like that are going to connect like one really big ridge to another really big ridge? Or are you more honed in on where a buck is probably living and you're getting on maybe something smaller where you're just trying to get that deer to come by you as opposed to hunting some giant funnel that's probably going to have more deer coming through it?
It depends on the time of the year. If it's early season, I'm going to be looking for, obviously trying to get in between his bed and food. And, that steep terrain, like I use Spartan Forge and that new LiDAR app. LiDAR section they have that really dials in on some like very minute terrain features. You'll see little micro benches that could be a bed for him, or you'll see like little micro benches, anything that can kind of make his travel a little bit easier. And I like to look at those spots. But when it comes time for the rut, I really like to find compounding terrain features. So one of my favorite things is, a lot of people call them a spoke or, a spider web, where you have a bunch of finger ridges coming into a saddle or some main ridge. So that's going to give you all kind of points of contact. So you're going to be able to catch deer traveling through there. So, you're ideally, if you're honed in on an area that, you got a big deer living and he's out searching for does, that's going to give you your, multiple options for travel. And then also, talking about the roamers and stuff like that, you can set that too and see a deer you never seen before.
Yeah, that's an interesting subject because sometimes I'd be curious to see if you've seen the same thing. And like we're definitely not experts at hunting big terrain, but we have started doing it more in the last couple of years. And last year there was a spot in particular that Jacob ended up killing a buck at. I had scouted it, and just the way that the terrain set up, we had this whole thing last year. He called it "Trust the Terrain" because of this situation. There was a big secondary coming off the main mountain, and there was a big saddle right where they met. And it was obvious that deer were coming off that main mountain and down that secondary, and they had to pretty much go through that area. But when you went in there, you might find some punch holes in the leaves. There might have been like one little basketball, scrape, and there was maybe some older rubs. But the buck sign in there was pretty slim compared to other places that we were hunting further down that secondary. And at least our theory with it was, they're just transitioning through here, like they're literally just walking through this. They're not stopping and rubbing a tree and working a scrape. They're just transitioning through it. And so that's why I didn't want to hunt it that day. Jacob's like, "You sure you don't want to go there?" I was like, "No, you go hunt it." And he goes there and shoots a nice buck. And that's why I didn't want to hunt it, was because of the lack of sign. So I'm just curious if you've seen the same thing, and how do you account for that?
Yeah, I mean, because a lot of times on those saddles like that, you'll have those. Most of your deer are going to be cutting the edge of it, or you may have a scrape right there in that saddle, and you can put a cam on that scrape, and you may not, you may get that buck there every once in a while, like, but that doesn't mean he's not checking it. He will be on that downwind thermal, or even the wind may play a factor, and he'll be right off. So you can sometimes look and you'll see a little faint trail right there, and that's where you can. And most of the guys obviously are going to be set up over that scrape, right? And they'll see that buck, he may be out of range. But if you find that little faint trail, or you may just see right off that edge there, you may see like one rub, somewhere through there. That shows that he's using that, and that older age class deer, he may not want to be included in the group, but he wants to know what the group is doing. So he's going to scent check that. And also, I really do like, when your main points come out, like I always see those deer cutting those points too. So that's another terrain feature I'll look for too, or at least go to look for sign.
Real quick, can you explain cutting those points? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So, in the Appalachian range, mountains vary. Our mountains here are real old. They say, some of the oldest in the world, and it's higher elevation. So they're bigger. Your main ridges are wider, and they'll kind of come down to a slope, and you'll see trails cutting that in, because you rarely don't see them unless there's like a weakness or a drainage coming up. Like they do like to use those weaknesses to kind of cross that point, but most of the time, if you find those points that come down and they start to knob out, you can find trails or signs cutting that in, and that's a really good. Like I was in a spot today, a new spot in that area I haven't looked at, and found a lot of good sign on that exact same terrain feature.
Yeah. So we got the video podcast. You're doing some hand motions, so people go watch that on YouTube. But for the audio listeners, to explain that a little bit better, like you're saying that the end of the ridge will go and kind of round off, kind of like if you were to stick your thumb straight out, and the deer are like cutting around, like walking your thumbnail, basically.
Yeah, essentially like cutting that point.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because you don't see them. Never I may see some does or bears traveling that main ridge, but your buck's always going to be on the edge. About your third down is kind of a good rule of thumb. You're going to find those trails cutting that, and they'll cut around and either go down to the bottom from, because you'll find those, if it's an area that has deer, you'll find those trails coming down both sides. Like if it's a north-south ridge, you'll find those trails on the east and west side. And that's kind of here. The thing I've noticed about, because I hunt the mountain range, in Virginia, West Virginia, Ohio, don't really hunt Tennessee much, but I found deer using terrain features differently in different areas based on how it is. Like where I hunt in West Virginia, for instance, is extremely steep, a lot of ridges. I mean, it's just like ridge after ridge that are up and down, up and down, up and down. And I was having a hard time the first year I went there because I was hunting it the way I hunt here. And I started talking to some locals, and they're like, oh, the deer run straight down the ridge and off the points. And I started doing that, and I started finding more, that's when I started seeing my bucks.
That's funny you say that, because I was in West Virginia this year turkey hunting with Josh Ireton from the Untamed, and while we were out there, I was keying in on deer sign too, just like looking at some of the stuff and how the deer are using it, and I saw the same thing because like I don't know exactly where you were in West Virginia, but some of that stuff, like those ridges aren't very wide, like especially so like you have the main ridge system, but you have all these secondary points, like you said, that just parallel, and you have one every 300 yards cutting to the north, to the south, or east or west. But it's like all that sign, like they're so steep, like you'd find some on the slopes, but it was like all that sign specifically was like going off those points, and it seemed like the points itself were more gradual, where a deer can follow that point all the way down if it's trying to drop in elevation. It's still extremely steep. A lot of stuff on slope angle shading was like dark red on the slopes. Yeah. And that's kind of interesting. Like that's something you found as well, was like the congregation of travel and movement and everything on the tops kind of dropping off more so than just on the sides itself. Because I don't know, like one thing I saw was so much deadfall on the side of those slopes. The deer would have to constantly be going up and around or down below all this deadfall and all this timber, versus kind of running that top edge and just kind of dropping straight off the points if they wanted to.
Yeah, I don't hunt too far from him, actually. Josh and I are pretty good buddies. He calls them razorback ridges. I call them shark fins, because that's what they remind me of. Yeah. And I never had used cameras there, and I'm hunting there this year, to be honest. And what I started doing with cameras there is putting my cameras not far off the road on where those points come down. Mm-hmm. And man, I mean, it's insane. Like that doesn't work here, but there it's like all those deer are coming down to the water that way. And I've been able to find, some good deer there. I almost killed a big deer there last week, actually, by doing that. And because there too, man, unlike here, it's really thick. I mean, there's lots of briars there. I mean, you rarely run into a briar thicket up here. I mean, it's just very spotty. It's like, I'm a big fan of those new Trace First Light pants, and they won't last in a briar thicket, but here I can wear them all day long, and I'm not gonna wear them out.
Yeah, and see, that's something interesting. This is one thing I love about talking like the mountains, and even like, we talk more hill country or river bottom habitat. It's like it can be so different in so many different areas, and like how the deer use that area and how the habitat may be different, even though you're still in the mountains. We talked to the guys over in, say, the Ozark Mountains in, southern Missouri, northern Arkansas. and it hunts very differently from some of the guys in like North Georgia and East Tennessee and even North Carolina, just like the habitat and everything. And some of those mountains are a little bit more rolled edge. They have more of a rolled top to it, where some of the stuff that you guys maybe be on, a lot more steep faces, steeper drops, kind of going off the side, and a little more aggressive terrain per se. And it's just fascinating, like how you can interview one guy from like North Georgia and then getting you on from North Carolina and someone from East Tennessee, and they all see the deer do a little bit different stuff, and maybe they hunt it slightly different. But in the grand scheme of things, one of the common factors between all these guys is hunting higher in elevation, not staying down the bottom, not getting distracted by the sign you find way down a creek bottom, but finding the stuff up higher in elevation, catching whether they're rut hunter, catching bucks cruising like that top third, kind of over the top of all these secondary points, going through some of these terrain features, or also just bedding in higher areas as well, and kind of getting yourself not distracted by the low elevation stuff. Because I think that's something that, if I had to guess, a lot of guys probably get distracted by what they're finding down the bottoms, and they stay down there, but the deer aren't down there unless it's dark for the most part, down real low in elevation. And it's like you got to like cut that out and start climbing and have that suck factor of, hey, I'm going to climb ever how many feet of elevation, whether, you're in areas, where, maybe you're climbing 800-900 feet, or 500-600 feet, or in other areas you might be climbing thousands of feet in order to kind of get up to where they're at. Like, talking to Nathan Killen and one of our buddies, Devin Duncan from Virginia, they're talking about climbing thousands of feet sometimes in order to kind of get up where the deer are actually at and not get distracted by everything down the bottoms, because those deer are making such long runs in the evening getting down there. Like, if you're hunting that sign, that deer's not going to show up till 11 or 12 o'clock at night. He'll mill around down there and he'll start cruising back up or going back up, or just start side hilling. So that is a very interesting factor when it comes to like interviewing all these different mountain hunters and kind of all the different factors that play out. And even like what you're saying, again, how different, the mountains were in West Virginia compared to what you're dealing with in North Carolina, and how they hunt a little bit different. The deer use them a little bit different, but again, kind of making you a versatile mountain hunter by experiencing all those different things and, using different strategies and styles and tactics in different areas just based off how the deer are using it.
Yeah. And I will say, I wouldn't like not put any attention to the sign you find on the bottoms. Like, that's a good place to put a camera to see what's in the area, to do some inventory checking, but I'm never going to hunt that. So if I find a good deer in that sign, kind of like, the one I was talking about, I killed in 18, like I knew I was going to get him on cam there, but I knew right then I wasn't going to kill him there. So I just started backtracking it. And, any of these like drainages and stuff feeding down into there, you just, after you find that deer coming down there, you start checking all those to start finding that big sign. Is you kind of backtrack from the sign up the mountain, to your point.
That's another terrain feature I was going to ask you about, is how often specifically these mature bucks like using these super subtle drainages or these draws coming off the tops as a point of travel, not necessarily walking down the middle of that drainage, but side hilling down these drainages or up these drainages for travel, for travel paths.
I see it a lot, especially, during the rut, because they want to come down there, and that's where most of your does are going to be, and they're going to chase does at night, and they're going to make their way back up to their beds. That's a definite like focus of mine for sure.
Okay, awesome.
I have a question about kind of going back to thick cover, just because I'm curious about this. As we've talked about earlier in the podcast, you do look for higher stem count areas, but you also hunt where you're not running into any people. And we actually just had a recent interview with Stuart Keene in North Georgia, again, mountain hunter, low deer density, and he was talking about not necessarily getting so locked down on thick cover just because it's so low pressure that it's not like other places that we hunt where you pretty much have to be looking into a thicket to be able to get a crack at a buck most of the time. Just because of how high the pressure is, they just stay in that cover. So one thing I wanted to ask you is, do you have to have really thick cover that makes you confident in an area? Or if you're finding the right kind of sign and it's just not that thick, you're still going to hunt it because the situation is right and it's so low pressure that you don't feel like they have to stay in that thick cover all the time?
I mean, the only reason I'm looking for like any type of high stem count stuff is for food. It's not necessarily for bedding. It's just a food source, because I think, like saying earlier, I do think, a lot of their beds are visual. They like to see. So, you'll find a lot of their beds behind either like a fallen tree or up behind like a bigger old growth standing tree. You'll find a bed right behind that on like a little micro bench. Because they like to be, because they can see really well. Obviously when the leaves all drop in that big timber, man, they can see hundreds of yards from that area. And then, obviously can escape. I think, sometimes you think that you're not jumping deer or hearing them blowing at you, that there's no deer there. I think a lot of times they just see you before and they just don't make much noise when they leave.
That's exactly where I was going to go. You just went down the way I wanted to kind of ask the question is, I was going to ask you, how often do you think, you may get a deer up, but he's not blowing at you and you don't hear him because he sees you from a distance and he just kind of eases out of there? Because that's something that I think I've kind of found a little bit more recently in some areas that we're hunting, where like those deer clearly are bedding with more of a visual bedding location, like maybe focus on thermals, but also like focus on like a visual spot where they can see a good way, especially when leaves come off. And I thought the same thing, that like you may go in there, you might not hear you jump a deer up or not see a deer, but doesn't mean there wasn't a buck there that just got up and slipped out or just held tight and for you to walk by him at 75, 80 yards, and then maybe he got up later after you moved by him. But it seems like that's something you probably find quite a bit up there in North Carolina.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, most of the time, a deer, older deer anyway, like they don't always blow anyway. They just kind of sneak out or they get out of there unless they like really see you and they put it all together and they call through wind and identify like, oh, that's danger. Then that's when they start alerting everybody else. Is my opinion. But yeah, there's been, I don't know, there's been, I'm not gonna say it happens every year, but I have been cruising through an area and then see a bed that I come up on that's got fresh hair. It's getting used, and obviously you could tell it's being used that morning. And more than likely, he slipped out of there as I was coming and didn't even alert at all. He just kind of slipped out. I see that pretty regularly.
With the beds that you find, what tells you what kind of bed are you looking for that is going to be a bed that you pin and maybe keep in the back of your mind? I mean, is it just like wallowed out, worn to dirt, smells like buck piss, or is it just an indention in the leaves? Like what gets your attention, or it has a buck in it that you jump out and you're like, okay, that's where he's hanging out. I mean, what are you looking for that gets you excited when you actually go find a bed?
Well, I mean, when your acorns are dropping, a buck, he may have a couple beds that he beds down on before he gets back to his primary bed. So you can find those, beds that are, not as high up the mountain, like he'd been down there feeding at night and working his way back, and then he laid down. And that's why a lot of times, when you're hunting mornings, you have a buck come in towards his bed at like 9:30, and he's just making his way back. You see that a lot, especially on a full moon night. But the beds that I really want to focus on, like to be bed hunting, are the ones that are the big ones. I mean, obviously, the size of the bed's going to dictate the size of the deer. A big mature buck's going to have a bigger bed than a younger buck or a doe. But what I really like to find is those ones that, like you were saying, that are kicked out pretty good, a lot of poop around them, a lot of historical rubs in that area. You can kind of see, like, you've got all the past year's rubs, so it's a deer's primary bed. And if you see a few years of historical rubs there, that could be a deer's older age class deer, because we got three different years of historical rubs here. That's something I definitely like to find.
Let me ask you, I've got quite a few questions on the bed specifically, but how often, because I'm going to get to Andrew's question here in a second, but so we've looked at a lot of GPS data. We got our hands on some data a couple of years ago that Auburn University had done, tracking collared bucks both on public land in Alabama, along with some hunting clubs. Yeah, I think it was like a total of was it probably 30 bucks or so?
No, it was more than that. I can't remember how much it was.
But Andrew was able. It was just a point of data, and Andrew was able to actually build maps out with all the different points that we could kind of go through on aerial imagery and kind of see how these bucks are using certain areas. And a commonality that we found with a lot of these bucks is some bucks would have one or two beds that they would kind of focus on, and every now and then they do a little excursion during different times of the year and bed off on other points. And then other bucks would have 5 or 6 different beds. And this is much more rolling hill country, closer to some flat land kind of habitat.
I mean, that's mostly right. I would say that pretty much all of them had 5+ beds. Most of them had like 10, but most of them would have like 2 that they favored most of the time.
And what I was going to get at with you in North Carolina and some of the other mountains you've hunted, do you feel like these bucks have a bunch of multiple beds, or do you think it's like during certain times of the year when you find these deer and find these beds, they're using 1 or maybe 2 beds at most during a very specific time of the year? Or again, do you think they have multiple different bedding locations that they will target?
I mean, I think that's probably based on the individual deer himself. more so than anything. But when I find an older deer, I typically, if I'm able to find a couple of his beds, I'll see him using those predominantly. And, he may, like I said, if he's going out and feeding, he may have some little small secondary beds he hits coming back, but he's usually going to be in that same area. It's like this deer I'm hunting right now. I know early season, one of his primary beds, actually, I went looking at my map one day when I was scouting and kind of got on some private, and he's got a primary bed on the private. And, and where I always see him coming out, he, skirts side hill of a north facing side and comes to this little saddle and pops out, and he'll usually lay early season sign right there. And I and I got him on a mock scrape there first, and then I found his own scrape a few weeks later after that. And then every year I'll get him, on that scrape on cam, or he'll lay some rubs out. Like this year he rubbed right there in that pocket where he likes to pop out of. But he's always in that bed early season.
Interesting. And I also, when it comes to that GPS study, there was just some interesting things that we noticed about how the deer were actually bedding. And a lot of the times they were bedding in pretty close conjunction with some kind of terrain feature. And usually that meant they were bedded in or directly adjacent to a hub, or they were bedding directly adjacent to a you good? Or they were bedding directly adjacent to a saddle. So they would be kind of offset from that saddle, where it kind of seemed like they could definitely monitor that saddle. Is that something that you see in the mountains as well, where they're kind of keying in on those terrain features, like maybe almost like they're trying to monitor it potentially?
Yeah, monitoring, and it's just a path of their travel, and like I said, like in that saddle situation, he's always got sign there, so he's pretty close by. He can easily check it on his way in and way out. See what's going on, especially as you get closer to the rut. And usually, they'll come out there at night and feed on those saddles too, on acorns, if you got a lot of acorns in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was another thing that we noticed with the GPS data that we looked at, is like they'd be bedded maybe directly adjacent to a saddle, and sometimes they'd go up and over that saddle, or if they're above a hub, they would ease down into that hub after dark. Because this data, we could also see what time of day, so it took an hour, or it took a point like every, I don't know, 30 minutes or so. So you could see what kind of movement they were doing, like what time of day. And so we were able to like color coordinate the things and everything and look at it. And it was really fascinating, because a lot of times there would be a circuit. And this wasn't a low deer density area at all, but there would be somewhat of a circuit there, where it's like, okay, here he is, he's in his bed, now he drops into this hub right at dark, and now he does this big circle, and now he's in this bed over here, and now he's in that bed over there. And he would have like a lot of the bucks pretty consistently would have like 10 different daytime beds. And we were determining a daytime bed where it was like a whole bunch of daylight points on top of each other, where he spent like 3 or 4 hours in one spot at least, sometimes 12 hours in one spot. So we're like, obviously he's bedded there. And, there would be 1 or 2 spots that he went to more than the others, but it never seemed to be like, oh man, like he's using that bed, 4 times a week or something. It was never that consistent, but there was just some that he would come back to more often than others. And then it did seem like there was a circuit. And for this area, it was a really diverse area, and it had a lot of thick cover and a lot of deer. And that circuit was not very big at all for a lot of these deer. Some of them, it was pretty big, but most of them, it was not big. And some of the deer, especially early season, there was this one buck that had a bed up in some planted pines that you could tell they were thick underneath. And they'd come in and thin the pines, and, some thick cover grew up. And he was bedded in those pines, and he would kind of bed randomly throughout. He didn't have a defined bed because it was just so thick. He could kind of bed wherever. But today he'd be right here, and the next day he'd be right there, and the next day he'd be right there. But there was this big hardwood drainage beneath him, and he visited that same drainage within like a 1/4 mile stretch of that creek 27 nights in a row. Every single night he was in there. He might not be under the same tree, but within that little stretch, he was in there every single night. I'm assuming feeding on acorns or something, maybe persimmons too, because it was that time of year. But anyways, I'm getting on a tangent, but that was just some interesting things that we saw with that. And it kind of sounds like you might be seeing similar stuff, just on a larger scale.
Yeah, I mean, because another thing you got to think about when this super steep terrain is that there's not a lot of flat spots for them to bed either. You know, um, you got to find those little micro benches or knobs that they can bed on. And that's where like some of that imagery, like with that lidar, can kind of show you those little pockets and give you some hints. One thing I've been curious about is like early season when acorns are dropping and you got a full moon. I've witnessed this because I normally don't hunt and do all day sits early season, but I have noticed on trail cameras and when I like really keyed in on a deer and I'm willing to spend the time, noticing that you'll see a buck get up and like 10, on a full moon night, get up in the middle of the day and come out and eat. Have you ever, did you ever correlate any of that data to that?
Like specifically to moon phase.
Yeah, moon phase, not necessarily position, but phase, because they're out feeding all night. And, because I just don't, a deer's like us. He's not going to lay in the same spot all day long, right? He's going to get up, move around, and eat a little bit, browse, and then go back to his bed. He may not go far, right? But like I have noticed, and I don't know how many times like I've been hunting early season, like on an out of state hunt, for instance, and you're out there, it's a full moon, you're not seeing any activity in the afternoons or in the mornings, but then you go in the middle of the day to go scout, and all of a sudden you see deer up on their feet in the middle of the day. And I don't know, it's just like something I've been like toying with myself. And I've heard, I talked to Alan about that, and he said that he definitely, like if he's in a core area of a buck and there's a full moon, he definitely will hunt that 10 to 2 range during that time of year.
Yeah, I don't think we ever drilled down hard into the moon stuff. We did drill down hard into the wind and specifically wind-based bedding, and I
Mhm.
could not even find an example of one of these deer that seemed to be bedded like wind to back.
Yeah.
It was completely inconsistent. And part of our theory on that is most of the time they're bedding in just like the thickest stuff ever.
Hmm.
Old cutovers, 4 or 5 year old cutovers that are really, really dense and thick, the kind of stuff you'd release rabbit dogs into and rabbit hunt. But they're not usually bedded right on the edge. They're usually anywhere between like 20 to 40 yards into it.
Hmm.
And the wind filtering through that stuff, I don't think the wind's consistent in there anyways, but I think they're more of like a sound based bedding because you ain't
Yeah.
getting to them, without them hearing you. So I don't think they have to use the wind based thing in that area. But that's really the only thing that we drilled down to. It was that, and they love to bed next to road intersections. That
Hmm.
was another consistent thing. Whether it was on the public land or the hunting clubs, all these different deer, they seem to like road intersections for one reason or another. I don't really. I think it's because people just drive past it and they're not getting in there. But man, they will bed. They ain't afraid of roads.
Yeah,
At least around
and
here.
all those roads, some of them were drivable, some of them were just walk-in access roads. And I actually we brought it up because we did videos. This is all on our Patreon for people that want to go see us, like hours worth of footage where we kind of like break all this stuff down, different bucks. But I was curious with the data, like is that part of the data where this the deer they were able to dart or catch with net guns or whatever were just the ones closest to the road, and that's like just their personalities, like, hey, we're going to bed close to that, or is that just a commonality factor on these pieces of property that because there's so much road access on some of these areas, like you couldn't walk more than a mile in any direction, not hit another road,
Hmm.
that they just naturally funneled into those little areas, like any like low spot next to the road, like a little saddle crossed the road, or a road went through a little saddle, or like a little thermal hub next to the road. Is like they were bedding like just off those little ditches and drainages in and around some thick cover. Like there was one buck I remember specifically. It looked like on aerial imagery he was bedded underneath a big oak that had Chinese privet thicket all around it.
Hmm.
And that was like this one buck to come to mind. It was right next to the road, probably 60 yards off the road, 80 yards off the road, in this little thicket next to a thermal hub. He was bedded right against one of the ditches that ran into that thermal hub. And it was just like a fascinating location. And that buck, I remember on at least a couple of the days we were looking, he would spin within 40 yards of that tree all day long, just like milling around right there, probably browse on acorns dropping or whatever, and then just go back and lay back down. And then when it got close to dark, he'd make his little run in the evening. But yeah, but again, that's somewhere that's down in Alabama, Rolling Hill, highly managed timber, a lot of clear cut activity, a lot of just overall forest management, and it seemed like those deer in those areas just didn't move all that much until we started looking at some of the rut data, and then you'd have a couple bucks. A lot of those bucks would start expanding those ranges, moving more during daylight hours, stuff like that. And that was another factor I think we found that during because this place doesn't rut until later in the season, like getting into like close to January, but like in November, which wouldn't even really classify a whole bunch of pre-rut, you would start seeing activity of these bucks starting to kind of cover ranges. And we found there was 2 bucks that were collared, that there was a big ridge system that split them, probably about 3/4 of a mile between the deer.
Yeah.
And they would come and get to that ridge point, but they would never cross that ridge system. They would work their way to that spot, and then each buck would turn around. One would go back to the north, one would go back to the south, but they never would cross that ridge in between those 2 bucks. It was really fascinating because you see the points of the data that they'd get within, not necessarily the same time, but they'd get within like 100 yards of each other, and then spin around and start working their way back down those different creek drainages, just whether they're looking for does or what during that time of the year. So it was really, really fascinating data, and that's something that I found that was really enjoyable from a southeast perspective. But when you start looking at it from your perspective in the mountains, I've always heard Nathan Killen talking about, these bucks can be, some of the bucks, it's personality based, can be very nomadic. They can make these huge loops, these big circuits. And it's like down here in this super dense, thick cover, there's so many deer. It's almost shows that they just don't have to do that because there's plenty of does, there's plenty of food. They don't have to make those big circuits necessarily like you would see potentially in the mountains per se.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think it's all, a lot of deer are different, their personality wise, and one thing, talking about those deer bedding off the road. And I think that's just, I don't run into that much here. I wish I could, because, I do enjoy the adventure of getting way back in there, but, I'd love to have a spot that I could walk 250, 500 yards. That'd be awesome. But I cannot find deer close to the road. But in those areas that are heavily hunted and heavily pressured, that's the only place they can find that can be a sanctuary, because people aren't really just jumping right off those roads. And I noticed, this buck I almost shot last week in West Virginia, like he was literally on this bench, using this bench, him and 2 other bucks, that was about 200 yards from the road. I could see school buses going by, and it was just awesome. I mean, it was straight up. It was like 50% grade, but it was just right there off the road. And I think that area had one little parking spot, and but what I noticed about hunters in some of these areas, and here too, is the majority of your hunters like to start out with a gate access or some type of road. No, not many people like to start out bushwhacking and walking straight uphill. Like I don't like doing it. I just have to. You know what I mean? Like there's so many mornings I'm on the way. Like this morning going hunting, I woke up at 4, and I had to leave my truck at 5 to be able to get up there, because it's about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. And like I just dread starting, because like as soon as I start, it's about 45 minutes of straight uphill. And most people aren't willing to do that, So like, I think when you go to these other areas in any national forest in general that has a little bit higher hunting pressure, get yourself away from those trailheads and those gates, because that's where most people, they want to walk that easy walk. And then after they warm up a little bit, they don't mind probably getting up a little bit up in the mountains. But I think that's typically, anywhere you go, if you just got to look for these off the beaten path type situations. And I don't think deer, like have a big enough memory. You hear people talking about deer bedding, looking at parking spots to see hunters coming in. I don't think they necessarily do that. I think it's just the reason you end up finding them there is just based on like nobody's really hunting right there and messing with them. I don't think they're, have a strategy in their head to, oh, I want to bed next to this parking because I want to see the hunters coming in. I don't think that's true, and the reason I say that is because how many times have you shot at a deer, like a year, miss them or whatever, and you end up shooting that deer or getting another opportunity or seeing them there the next year? We as humans, if we got shot at a place, we wouldn't be going back to that spot again, right? So I just, I don't think their memory is that long.
So Jason, I want to say we're going to get you back on again, talk about the a little more on like the spike camping aspect, because I want to do that, but we're already an hour, 20 minutes or so into this podcast. So as a point of wrapping up, let me ask, do you have any kind of like final thoughts or takes for any of our guys or any of the listeners that are, hunting more mountainous areas things for them to kind of focus on going into the season? You know, season's already here on us, but you know, anything if they struggled specifically throughout the season just locating bucks, is there any kind of specific thing you'd give them as a point of reference to kind of go out there and maybe focus on to help them kind of build a little bit of confidence kind of going into the season?
I mean, I think the biggest thing, and I have to keep telling myself, is like, you got to be hunting, you know, if you're not finding sign, don't hunt just because the area looks good all the time. Like if you really want to get active, and I suck at this at home because I focus on deer that I know and I'm trying to kill, but like out of state, like if I'm not seeing sign, I'm gonna keep walking until I find it. And so the main thing, if you're gonna kill a deer or get an opportunity, you need to walk until you find the good sign, and then you need to sit there and wait it out. If you're in this lower deer density area where these deer are a little bit nomadic, the only way you're going to kill them is time the stand, and that's the truth to it. Like, you have to just stay there and stay positive. Like, you know, the other night I was walking out and I was really feeling a little beat because I put a lot of time in this deer and I put a lot of scouting. I've been hunting 4 years. I put a lot of postseason scouting in this year, and I really wanted to kill this deer early season. And early season's not over yet, but like, I've been hitting it hard, working the right weather patterns and everything that I've traditionally known to get a buck on his feet. And I just, you know, it just didn't work out. And I was feeling a little bit defeated, but I have to remind myself it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Like, you can't give up. You just got to keep going. And I had a guy message me today talking about how, you know, it's hard to stay positive when you're seeing everybody else dropping these big deer on social media and stuff. And this guy said, the only thing I've seen is a buck that hadn't even made his first breeding season yet. And the thing is, we don't know the past history on a lot of these deer that you see people on the internet showing. You don't know if they haven't seen anything until that deer. So you just got to stay positive and focus on your own hunt.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm right there with you, dude. Right there with you. Don't get so caught up in the social media and what others are doing, because those other guys aren't necessarily in your same position or situation. So, you know, if you have confidence doing what you're doing, you know, buckle down with it. If you don't have confidence in what you're doing, you need to change one thing or the other. Find you a mentor, find somebody who can kind of help coach you in the right direction to put you in the right position, or at least help build the confidence of whatever you're hunting, figuring out, you know, where you're potentially going to have the most success, and kind of buckle down on it. So, Jason, greatly appreciate you coming on the podcast, man. I'd love to get you back on the episode, talk some more, because I've got a bunch of other questions. And again, we don't really want to be here necessarily for 3.5 hours, and I know you're a busy man yourself, but just greatly appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing some information with us, and hopefully look forward to getting you back on here.
Yeah, man, anytime. I'd love to talk about the spike camp stuff. That's fun. Yeah, we should do that, definitely. And I really appreciate you guys having me on. And yeah, if you ever make it up this way, give me a holler.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Tell people where they can find you and find all your stuff.
I mean, for me, like, my personal is private. Like, I don't really do much on my personal social media, but like, you know, I own Timber Ninja Outdoors, so that's the easiest place to find us is on social, YouTube or Facebook, any of that stuff. Timber Ninja Outdoors.
Awesome.
Sweet.
Perfect.
We'll link it in the description too.
Yep. Awesome.
Cool.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Listeners, thank y'all for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure you share it with a couple buddies. And if you really enjoyed the episode, go leave us a 5-star written review on iTunes. Appreciate all the new reviews coming in. And by the way, guys, as a reminder, we have new merch that just dropped on the store. You can go to the Southern Outdoorsman's website and check out all the new hats and everything that we just launched. And hopefully there's still some available by the time this episode comes out.
Yeah, we'll see.
Already sold out a couple
That old school camo hat went quick.
Yeah, absolutely. So appreciate everybody joining us. And Jason, thank you for joining us. And listeners, just remember, y'all stay Southern.